بعد نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اقتفى أثره واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah. We'll read from the book entitled Al-Musannaf li Abi Bakr Abdullah ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Shayba rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 235 after the Hijrah. And we are still in the section entitled Kitab al-Tahara, the section that deals with purification. And the chapter the author presents is Fil Wudu'i bi Su'r al-Himar wal Kalbi man kariha. This chapter deals with the wudu made with water left over after drinking by a donkey or a dog, and those who disapproved of it. The water that is left over after a donkey or a dog drunk from it, and those who disapproved of it. This topic is based upon the conversation of, does water become najis when it is small in amount by simply coming into contact with a najis substance? So as we all know that the scholars, they disagree as it relates to water. We agree that there is water that is tahur, and we agree that there is water that is najis, water that is pure and purifying, and water that is impure and makes things dirty. But there is disagreement about water that is najis. And the water that is najis, from that which there is disagreed about regarding it, is if there is a small amount, does that water become najis by simply coming into contact with with something else that is or with something that is najis? If there is a small amount of pure water, does it become najis by simply coming into contact with something that is najis? Or is it necessary before it becomes najis for its taste, color, or smell to change? And so according to the former, if it becomes najis by simply coming into contact, then when this dog or when this donkey drunk from it, then it's known that the backwash of a dog or a donkey is something that is considered to be najis. And so here they would say that the water becomes najis by simply coming into contact with the tongue or the body of the dog or the donkey, as opposed to those who say, no, it's necessary even if it's a small amount for its taste, color, or smell to change. Then they would hold the view that it is permissible. It's still tahir or tahur in this circumstance, because none of these qualities have changed. And so this chapter is regarding the conversation surrounding making wudu from such water, that water that is left over by a donkey or a dog after they have drunken from it, and those who dislike that. This is going to be establishing the support or the rebuttal for those who dislike that issue. The verifier, Sheikh Sa'd al-Shithri, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, he said in his footnotes in this chapter, he said, there has also come another wording for this chapter titled Babu Man Kariha Su'r al-Himari wal Baghli wal Kalb. Some of them also include in the chapter title the statement the mule. And we all know the mule is the mixture of the horse and the donkey. I believe it's a male donkey mounts a female horse and impregnates her, and that which she gives birth to is considered to be a mule or an ass, which is a mixture, a crossbreed, a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. And these are considered to be najis as well, due to what they are made from the mixture of a pure substance, a horse, and an impure substance, a domesticated donkey. So mules and asses are those animals that are considered to be najis as well. So we have these three najis animals: the donkey, the mule, and the dog. Ash-Shithri Hafidhullah, he says that Abu Hanifa and Ahmed, قال أبو حنيفة وأحمد بمنع الوضوء بسؤرهما. Abu Hanifa and Ahmed, they both established, or they have both stated, the impermissibility, the prohibition of making wudu with the water that is left over after drinking by either of the two of them, i.e. by a donkey or a dog. وقال مالك بجوازه. As for Imam Malik, then he stated that it is permissible to make wudu with this water that is left over by the two of them. وَمَنَعَ الشَّافِعِيُّ مِنْ سُؤْرِ الْكَلْبِ دُونَ سُؤْرِ الْحِمَارِ. And Ash-Shafi'i, he made it impermissible. He prohibited the making of wudu with the water left over by a dog, but deemed it to be okay with the water left over by a donkey. وَمَذْهَبُهُ أَرْجَحُ. The Sheikh Hafidhullah Ta'ala, he says, in the view of Ash-Shafi'i is more preponderant. It is the stronger view. And perhaps the justification of the Sheikh Hafidhullah Ta'ala Ash-Shithri in deeming the preponderance to be with the view of Ash-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala is that well-known hadith, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on Abi Hurairah, إِذَا وَلَدَ الْكَلْبُ فِي إِنَاءِ أَحَدِكُمْ. If a dog licks or drinks out of the, laps its tongue into the container of one of you, then let him wash it 7 times, one of them with dirt. In some of the narrations it says, and pour it out. You need to pour it out, the water, before washing it out 7 times with dirt. And so the pouring out of it is something that the Prophet ﷺ commanded us to do, so it would not be acceptable to make wudu with it. That being the case, it's necessary to understand that that issue of pouring out the water that a dog has drunken out of does not necessitate that the water be najis. Yes, from the scholars are those that say that the water becomes najis, and this is their proof, and this is a strong proof in that issue. But it is not the only way to understand that command. That command of pouring the water out could be what they call any ta'abudiyun mahd, a simple act of worship that we don't understand the reason why, and it does not necessitate that the water itself is najis. But we've been commanded to pour it out. Similarly to making istinja. When we wipe our backsides, we have to wipe 3 times at least, even if it's clean on the first wipe. We're not allowed to stop wiping because on the first wipe, the area got clean. And so even though the area is clean, it does not necessitate that we can just stop the action because we've been commanded to do it at least 3 times. So there's a difference between the result of the judgment, which is the answer, that you have to pour the water out. That is agreeable upon, even though there are those who disagree about that as well. That is something that is agreeable upon, but that agreement does not necessitate that the water has to be najis. So there's a separation between this conversation of is the water najis or is the water something that has to be poured out? And that's why Shafi'i rahimahullah distinguished between the two of them, right? Because if it was simply an issue about the water being najis, then what stops the water becoming najis when a donkey drinks from it? But it could be that the pouring out of it is for a different reason. And if you have to pour it out, then you cannot make purification using it. In any circumstance, let's see what the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, Ibn Abi Shayba, has to say about this issue. He says, حدثنا حفص بن غياث عن عبيد الله عن نافع عن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما أنه كان يكره سؤر الحمار. Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, he says that Hafs ibn Ghiyath narrated to us on the authority of Ubaydullah, yani Ubaydullah ibn Umar, al-Umari, on the authority of Nafi', on the authority of Ibn Umar, radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, that he used to dislike the water left over after a donkey would drink, right? If a donkey drunk out of a bucket, out of a pail, out of a basin, and that water that was left over, Ibn Umar used to dislike that water. He would dislike that water. And I'm sure you all know, as it relates to the Salaf, the disagreement, like not a disagreement, but the recognition or the realization that sometimes when they say they disliked, the dislike was for prohibition. While at other times when they say dislike, the dislike was something just short of prohibition, meaning they didn't want to go all the way out and say it was haram, but it's something that they didn't themselves incline to or have a desire to do. And it could be for personal or for religious reasons that they just weren't confident enough to deem it to be haram. And so when you see a statement like this, they used to dislike, it's necessary to recognize it in this light. there's a reason why they avoided saying haram. And even if we consider that they deemed it haram, they didn't reach the level of certainty to be brave enough to attribute such a command or such a judgment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah, He says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَا تَصِفُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمُ الْكَذِبَ هَذَا حَلَالٌ وَهَذَا حَرَامٌ لِتَفْتَرُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. And don't say what your tongues put forward from the lies, that this is halal and this is haram, to invent a lie against Allah. So the Salaf, they would stop short of saying something was haram unless they were absolutely sure, even if they thought it was haram. But at the same point in time, sometimes they would say something is disliked because of a personal preference as well. Meaning not personal in themselves, but like personal view of the religion, not being 100% sure that it was haram. So even if we say that they thought it was haram, you have to recognize that they stopped short of saying haram for a reason. He says, حدثنا عبد الرحيم ابن سليمان عن حجاج وعبيد الله عن نافع عن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما أنه كان يكره سؤر الحمار والكلب. He says that Abdul Rahim ibn Sulaiman narrated to us on the authority of Hajjaj and Ubaidullah, on the authority of Nafi', on the authority of Ibn Umar. And Nafi' told us about Ibn Umar that he used to dislike the water left over by a donkey or a dog. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا حفص ibn Ghiyath and Ash'ath and Al-Hasan وابن سيرين أنهما كان يكرهان سؤر الحمار والكلب. Abu Bakr, he says that Hafs ibn Ghiyath, he narrated to us on the authority of Ash'ath, on the authority of Al-Hasan, yani Hasan al-Basri, and Ibn Sirin, yani Muhammad ibn Sirin, that the two of them used to dislike the water left over by a donkey or a dog. He says, حدثنا جرير بن عبد الحميد عن مغيرة عن إبراهيم أنه قال كان يكره يعني عن مغيرة عن إبراهيم قال أنه كان يكره سؤر البغل والحمار. Abu Bakr says that Jarir ibn Abdul Hamid narrated to us on the authority of Mughira, who told us about Ibrahim, and Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Mughira said that he used to, yani al-Nakha'i, used to dislike the water left over by a mule or a donkey. He used to dislike the water left over by a mule or a donkey. He says, حدثنا جرير عن مغيرة عن حماد أنه قال البغل من الحمار. Abu Bakr, he says that Jarir ibn Abdul Hamid, narrated to us on the authority of Mughira, on the authority of Hamad. He said that a mule is just a donkey. Meaning this issue of a mule, al-mutawallid, this issue of a hybrid mule, a mule being the mixture of a horse and a donkey. A horse is permissible, halal, tahir, and a donkey is impermissible, najis. So which one do we attach the mule to? Because it's 50-50. It was made from a donkey and a horse. Do we attach it to the permissible or to the impermissible? He gives us the statement of Hamad where he says, a mule is just a donkey, right? Attach it to the impermissible, right? A mule is from the types of donkeys. Al-baglu min al-himar. The mule is from the donkey. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا عبد الرحيم أن أشعث أن الحسن أنه كان يكره سؤر الحمار والبغل والكلب. Abu Bakr, he says that Abdul Rahim narrated to us on the authority of Ash'ath, on the authority of Al-Hasan. And Ash'ath, he told us about Al-Hasan that he used to dislike the leftover drinking water of a donkey, a mule, or a dog. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا ابن علي أو علية عن هشام الدستوائي عن حماد عن إبراهيم أنه قال كان يقول عن إبراهيم قال كان يقول لا توضأ بسؤر الحمار ولا بسؤر البغل ولا بسؤر شيء من السباع. Abu Bakr, he says that Ibn Ulayya narrated to us on the authority of Hisham al-Dastawai, on the authority of Hamad, who told us about Ibrahim. Hamad said that Ibrahim used to say, don't make wudu, la tawadda. And here the ta is dropped off. Sometimes when words have two tas back to back, they'll drop off one of them. تَتَنَزَّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالْرُوحُ, right? You might find them at times dropping the first ta off. So here he's saying, لا تتوضأ, يعني لا توضأ. Don't make wudu. Don't make wudu with the water left over by a donkey, nor with the water left over by a mule, nor with the leftover water of any predatory animal, any siba'. What siba' are those animals that are clawed or fanged who hunt for their food. The predatory animals of, talons from birds or claws from animals that hunt for their food. These are considered siba'. So don't drink from the leftover water of any animal from amongst the siba'. Now, he says, حدثنا وكيع عن مسعر عن ابن حكيم قال سألت أبا وائل عن سؤر الكلب فقال ما أحب مشاركته ما أحب مشاركته ما أحب مشاركته. Abu Bakr says that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Mis'ar, on the authority of Ibn Hakim. He said that I asked Abu Wa'il about the water left over by a dog. And so he said, I don't love to participate or be a partner with it. I don't love that I am one who's doing the same thing with it. La uhibbu musharakatahu. I don't want to share with him. I don't love to share with the dog. Subhanallah. Look at the Salaf, right? They would deem it inappropriate to share with the dog, to the extent that some of them say that it's haram to eat after a dog or drink after a dog. And we see now that the affairs have flipped and gone backwards far enough that nowadays you see from the people are those who eat after their dogs. They lick the ice cream after their dogs get a lick. وَيَعْذُ بِاللَّهِ. But this is Ibn Hakim asking Abu Wa'il, Shaqiq ibn Salama, and he would say, I don't love to share with it. I don't want to share with a dog. Instead, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the dogs go hunting for us, if the dog begins to eat the item that it caught itself, then that item becomes impermissible for us. So how could we then after that share in the meal of the dog? And to the fact that you see nowadays advertisements for human grade dog food. So you and your dog can sit down and share the meal together. So, as our Sheikh used to say, rahimahullah, al-America ghayr. America is different. Allah musta'an. Ibn Abi Shayba rahimahullah ta'ala, after bringing the chapter that talks about those who did not approve of the wudu from water that was left over by a dog or a donkey or a mule, he brings a chapter in which he says, Man qala la ba's bisu'r al-himar. Those who used to say there's nothing wrong with the leftover water of a donkey. Those who used to say that there's nothing wrong with the leftover water of a donkey. And you see here how Sheikh Ash-Shitri hafidhahullah ta'ala, this categorization, it supports the opinion of those who say, but as far as the dog, then no, right? It's an obvious omission of mentioning the dog in this chapter as well, even though there are those who say that it's okay with the water left over by a dog, depending on certain circumstances, etc. But the generality is if the water is low in amount and can be poured out, if a dog drinks from it, then it should be poured out because of that directive in the hadith. But here he says, chapter regarding those who say there's no harm in that which was left over by a donkey. He says, حدثنا ابن علي عن ابن جريج عن عطاء أنه كان لا يرى بأسا بسؤر الحمار. He says that Ibn Ulayya narrated to us on the authority of Ibn Jurayj, on the authority of Ata, that he did not see any harm with the leftover water of a donkey. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا عبد الأعلى and Ma'mar and الزهري قال لا بأس بسؤر الحمار. Right, and we see here, right, we see the differences of opinion, right? When we look at the previous chapters, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Abi Wa'il, Muhammad ibn Sirin, these are all individuals from Kufa and Basra, etc., with the exception of Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah ibn Umar Madani, la shak. But in these narrations, we see a theme of the people of Hijaz and the people of Medina. And so we see how that affects, right? For example, the madhab of Imam Malik, taking from the people of Medina, even though without a doubt Nafi and Ibn Umar were the scholars of Medina of their times. Anyway, this narration, he said that Abdul A'la narrated to us on the authority of Ma'mar, on the authority of Az-Zuhri, that Ma'mar said about Az-Zuhri, that he said, Az-Zuhri said, there's no harm in the water left over by a donkey. There's no harm in the water left over by a donkey, meaning you can make wudu from it, you can drink from it, there's no harm. And la'alakum ta'rifun, perhaps you all know the hadith that's in Bukhari from Abi Qatada, when the cat drunk out of his water, and so he lowered the vessel for it to get a better drink. And his wife, deemed that strange, and to which he replied with the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Innaha laysat najisa, innaha min at-tawafina alaykum wat-tawafat." This animal is not najis; is from that which goes in and about amongst you all, male and female versions of it. The point of it is that there is some room to say that the drinking after these animals is permissible. Although that narration, you can say, well, these animals aren't najis. The cat isn't najis, while the donkey and the dog and the mule and the predatory animals are. And so that's the difference. And so obviously we see how the disagreement can continue even with the existence of evidence that seems to support one side or the other. The next narration, he says, حدثنا محمد بن سواء عن أبي الجناب أن جابر بن زيد كان لا يرى بأسا بسؤر الحمار. He says that Muhammad ibn Sawa narrated to us on the authority of Abil Jinab that Jabir ibn Zayd, he used to see no problem with the water left over from a donkey. Abu Bakr says حدثنا غندر عن شعبة أنه قال سألت الحكم قلت توضأت بفضل سؤر الحمار فصليت قال لا تعد وسألت حمادا فقال أحب إلي أن تعيد أحب إلي أن تعيد. Abu Bakr says that Gundar narrated to us on the authority of Shu'bah, who said, I asked Al-Hakam, and so I said to him, I've made wudu with water that was left over after a donkey drunk, and then I offered salat. Do I need Al-Hakam? He said, you don't need to repeat it. You don't need to remake your salat. And then I asked Hamad, to which he said, it's more beloved to me that you repeat the salat. It's more beloved to me that you repeat the salat. He says, حدثنا وكيع عن إسرائيل عن جابر عن عامر قال لا بأس بسور البغل. He said that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Israel, on the authority of Jabir, on the authority of Amir. Amir said it's no harm that you there's no problem with the leftover water of a mule. There's no harm with the water left over by a mule. نعم. He says حدثنا وكيع عن إسرائيل عن جابر عن أبي جعفر قال لا بأس بسؤر كل دابة. He says that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Israel, on the authority of Jabir, on the authority of Abi Ja'far, who said there's no harm in any water left over by any animal. And like we say, this statement, it includes the dog, the predatory animals, whatever animal, there's no harm in any of the water left over by them. And this is supportive of the view that the water does not become najis until it changes. And how would we know if a water we approached was drunken out of by an animal or not if we weren't there to witness it and there are no traces in the water for us to recognize it? Now, and in support of this, there is the famous author of Umar, Ya Sahib al-Hawl, right? When one of his companions asked the owner of a particular basin or cistern, has any animal drunken out of this water? And he said, Ya Sahib al-Hawl, oh, owner of this cistern or this hole, this basin, don't respond to him. This individual is trying to do too much, right? Now, so those are those two chapters. The next chapter, he says, Fil wudu'i bi su'r al-farsi wal ba'ir. We talked about the najis animals, a dog, a donkey, a mule. What about the animals that are not najis? He says this chapter is the wudu with the leftover water of a horse or a camel. The water left over by a horse or by a camel. Obviously, these animals are not najis, but it's something that could be slightly repulsive. We see the way camels' mouths are frothy and foamy and they spit. We see how horses and cows, etc., they eat, they chew cud. And this might be something any ta'afahul insan that an individual might be repulsed by and offish from doing. But this water that these animals that are permissible drink out of, can we make wudu out of them? And what about even if they change colors or taste or smell? They're the backwash where it comes out with this smell or this odor of camel or cud or something of that nature. So this chapter is about the wudu from the leftover water of a horse or a camel. Sheikh Ash-Shithri hafidhahullah ta'ala, he says, and in some of the versions it adds the statement or a cow or a sha. And a sha in Arabic is the cattle of those animals that include the goat and the sheep. When you say a sha in Arabic, it includes a goat or a sheep. Sheikh Ash-Shithri, he says, واتفق الأئمة على جواز الوضوء بسؤر ما يؤكل لحمه. He says the scholars are unanimously agreed upon the permissibility of wudu with the leftover water of that which its flesh is edible. If you can eat the animal, then the water that is left over after they drink from it is permissible by unanimous agreement. And so this chapter we see, because of this, it's very small. It's just something to point out in case anybody had a problem with it. Especially nowadays, you might see people who have a problem with it because, alhamdulillah, we have water in our homes, faucets that we turn off and turn on as we wish. He says, حدثنا وكيع قال حدثنا هشام الدستوائي عن قتادة عن عكرمة قال كل دابة أكل لحمها فلا بأس بالوضوء من سؤرها. He says that Waki' narrated to us. He said that Hisham al-Dastawai narrated to us on the authority of Qatada, on the authority of Ikrimah, who said that every animal that its meat is edible, then there is no harm in making wudu with the water left over after they drink. He says, حدثنا وكيع عن سفيان عن منصور عن إبراهيم قال لا بأس بسؤر البعير والبقر والشاء. He says that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Sufyan, on the authority of Mansur, on the authority of Ibrahim. MashaAllah, Isnad Jameel. He said there's no harm with the water left over from a camel or a cow or a sha. وهذه ثلاثة, these three categories, the fourth of them being what's included in the sha, the sheep and the goat. This is what is meant when they say Bahimatul An'am. Bahimatul An'am, or cows, camels, sheep, and goat. And these are the cattle that are necessary that you pay zakat on them. And so these are the things that are permissible for us to eat from the cattle. And so therefore it is permissible to make wudu with the water left over by them. We'll take one more chapter because it's small. He says, Al-wudu bi su'ri dajaja. Like, that's the animals that we can eat that are from Bahimatul An'am. So we talked about animals that we can't eat because they're najis. Donkeys, mules, dogs. We talked about animals that we can eat, but specifically that which is from Bahimatul An'am. What about animals that we can eat that aren't from the cattle? Like the author says, al-wudu bi su'ri dajaja. Wudu with that which is left over by chickens. Chickens might drink out of the water. Is it permissible to make wudu with this? And this is an important topic because you know that chickens can be considered nasty, right? The cage, the coop, you have to constantly clean it. There's the risk of salmonella, all of these diseases and things of this nature. What is the ruling of making wudu with water that might be in the chicken coop that the chickens drink out of, right? If I have this water, do I have to make wudu or can I make tayammum? Because this is the point of the issue. If I have this water, do I have to make wudu or can I make tayammum? Obviously, I don't have to use this water if I have other resources. But if I don't have other resources, Allah says, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, if you don't find any water, and this is water. So do I have to use the water that my chickens drink out of, or can I make tayammum? The author, he says, حدثنا محمد بن عبد الله الأنصاري أن أشعث أن الحسن أنه كان يقول في الدجاجة تشرب من الإناء يكره أن يتوضأ به. He says, in regards to this, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, he narrated to us on the authority of Ash'ath, on the authority of Al-Hasan, that he used to say regarding a chicken drinking out of a container, he would dislike that an individual make wudu with that water. He would dislike that an individual make wudu with it. And this is what we mentioned because of how some people are put off and repulsed, because chickens are dirty animals and the sickness that could be in it. And this shows you the depth of the knowledge of the Salaf, how they could differentiate between these animals. But in spite of that, you have the statement of Abu Ja'far and you have the statement of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i about those animals that are edible. Likewise, the statement of Ikrimah, those edible animals, should I say, instead of Nakha'i, he just said about the 4 Bahimat al-An'am. But Abu Ja'far and Ikrimah mention every animal and anything that is edible. And obviously from this is the chicken. Now that we've covered these 3 categories, that which is haram to eat because it's najis, and that which is permissible to eat, but from the cattle, and then that which is permissible to eat, but not from the cattle, there's still a category that's left. And the category that's left is that which is not permissible to eat, but is not najis. That which is not permissible to eat, but is not najis. And in this category, we find the foundation being the cat. The cat is not permissible to eat, but it is not najis. And like this, the taqsim, the categorization is complete. And so when we come back next time, inshallah, we'll see what the author mentions as it relates to making wudu with the water left over after a cat drinks. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.